The Advocates is made possible in part by a grant from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
Welcome to this special edition of The Advocates. I'm Judy Woodruff. We're here at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University to discuss the question that we all, or at least those of us who vote, will have to answer for ourselves next Tuesday. Who should be president? The advocate for Ronald Reagan is the publisher of the National Review, William Rusher. Mr. Rusher.
Ronald Reagan has been president of the United States for nearly 4 years, and the time has come to sum up the achievements of his administration and to decide whether to turn the destiny of this nation over to Walter Mondale. To help us make that assessment and that decision, we have with us today two people who have not only observed the Reagan administration closely, but actually participated in making it a success. Congressman Jack Kemp of New York and the United States Ambassador to the United Nations, the Honorable Jeane Kirkpatrick.
Thank you. The advocate for Walter Mondale is Massachusetts Congressman Barney Frank.
Thank you. The Equal Rights Amendment, a serious effort to reduce nuclear arms, protecting the environment, and worrying about the very poor. Walter Mondale and Geraldine Ferraro say yes to those things. Ronald Reagan and George Bush say no. To help you explain exactly the implications of that, I'll be calling on Governor Michael Dukakis of Massachusetts and Senator Christopher Dodd from Connecticut.
Month, the American people have seen 3 nationally televised debates between the candidates for president and vice president. But around each debate, the focus of attention seemed to be less on substance than on performance. Most of the comment afterward had to do with who looked better, who sounded better, or who had the most memorable one-liners. Well, in this forum, in an attempt to get the focus on the eve of the election back on the major issues that separate the two candidates, an advocate representing each one will state his case and then question 4 expert and partisan witnesses, 2 on each side. During the first half hour of the program, Congressman Jack Kemp will testify on Mr. Reagan's domestic policy, and Governor Michael Dukakis will do the same for Walter Mondale. Then in the second half, UN Ambassador Jeane Kirkpatrick and Connecticut Senator Christopher Dodd will testify on foreign policy. We'll begin now with Reagan advocate William Rusher.
I suspect we're going to hear a lot from the Democrats today about how the country isn't really better off economically than it was when Walter Mondale stepped down as vice president in January 1981. In this regard, let me urge you to rely on your own memory, your own eyes, and your own judgment. Who's forgotten the double-digit inflation, the 20% prime rate, the bracket creep that raised our taxes? And where are those now? America is vastly better off today. And the liberal Democrats know it, and they can't stand it. To nail this point down, I call upon one of the most prominent members of the House of Representatives from the 31st District of the state of New York, Congressman Jack Kemp.
Thank you for being with us,
Kemp, what was the economic state of this nation when Ronald Reagan took office in January 1981?
Bill, President Reagan inherited the worst economy since Franklin Roosevelt inherited the Hoover economy in 1932. As you pointed out, inflation, unemployment, interest rates, the prime rate, the mortgage rates were all going up. Productivity and jobs were going down. What's worse, there was a sign of inevitability. At least we were being told by the Liberal Democratic Party that this was part of a new era of limits, that we had both inflation and unemployment simultaneously, something that had never occurred in this country in our recent past.
And what were the principal policies that President Reagan instituted to change this state of affairs?
Well, basically, it was 4 major economic proposals: to restrain the growth of monetary policy to bring down inflation, to restrain government spending to reduce the drain on the resources of the private sector, to reduce the regulatory burden on private enterprise and on enterprising Americans in order to bring down prices on transportation and energy, as a couple of examples. And then finally, to reduce the tax burden on both labor and capital, to restore the incentive to help get America moving again, and to provide opportunity for working and saving and investing and the industriousness of the American economy.
And if those were the policies, now we're into the administration over 3.5 years. What have been the results of those policies?
Well, it is a strong economy. It's the strongest economic recovery going on in the world today. It's not everything that we want it to be. We need to expand that prosperity into the inner city, among minorities and among people who have been left on the sidelines. But nonetheless, this economy has created 6.5 million new jobs in a year and a half, and that's more new jobs in our private sector than Europe has created in a decade and a half. It's been done without inflation, and it's been done in an era in which many people had basically given up on the ability of the private sector to encourage the type of jobs, the creation of new wealth, the creation of new enterprises that are important to giving people not only a safety net, but a ladder of opportunity out of poverty.
And what's been the effect of this on such items as investment growth, unemployment decline, and taxes?
Well, some suggest that this has been a consumption-led recovery. It has not been a consumption-led recovery. Retail sales and consumption have actually lagged behind investment and the growth in the GNP. It has been an investment-led recovery. Indeed, so much so that wealthy Americans above the incomes of about $75,000 in America are actually paying higher revenues to the federal government since the rates came down in 1981 than they were paying under the Carter-Mondale years when tax rates were going up and we spent all our time trying to redistribute wealth.
Now, looking to the future, what does President Reagan propose for the future, and how do Mr. Mondale's proposals for the future differ?
Well, basically, the Mondale platform and that of the San Francisco Democratic platform is an attempt to try to balance the budget by raising taxes on Americans above the income of about $25,000 a year. They want to take off indexing above $25,000. They want surtaxes on single men and women at about $40,000 and on up to $100,000. The Republican platform and the President of the United States believe in tax simplification, taking out loopholes, bringing down the rates on both working men and women as well as those who want to save. We believe we can broaden the base. We think we can get the underground economy down by simplifying the tax code. We also think we can move this country to what is the important social and economic goal for America in the 1980s: full employment without inflation. A job for every American man or woman who wants a job, who needs a job. That is, frankly, the very best way to balance the budget, because you cannot balance the budget of the federal government by unbalancing the budget of the American family, and that's clearly what the Mondale Democratic platform would do, try to get America out of the red by putting the American people in the red.
I have no further questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rusher. Let's go to Congressman Frank for cross-examination.
Welcome to Massachusetts, Jack.
Thank you, Congressman Frank.
We have from President Reagan an acknowledgement that spending has to be cut. We've had a very severe deficit. He's told us that if we will take a look at the budgets he's already submitted and look at the cuts that he asked for and wasn't given, we'll know what he wants to cut in the future. One of those is Medicare. He submitted in '83 a proposal that when old people went to the hospital, they'd pay another $100 a day. Is that still part of the program that we can look forward to if the president is reelected? That's one that he submitted that Congress rejected, but he tells us he's going to resubmit it.
Well, the Congress did reject it, and I think they probably would reject it again if it were offered. But I don't know, and I don't think it will be.
Well, but he said that he
you
would
ought to
submit
ask
them again.
Mr. Mondale, because now he's talking about cutting $20 billion out of Medicaid or Medicare in the future.
Well, Mr. Mondale is talking about doing it explicitly in terms of the providers, and I understand why you don't want to talk about the Reagan record here, but you are here as a Reagan representative.
But he is going to do it, is that right?
Talking about the providers, but President Reagan has proposed that we cut Medicare. You don't know whether he still means that or not.
Let me
Is
make
that
a
the
point
answer?
about Medicare.
No, I'd like to ask the question. Do you know whether Ronald Reagan is still going to propose that cut in Medicare? If you don't, we'll pass on to the next issue.
No one knows. You don't know what your own
let's move
party's
on to the
gonna
next
do.
one.
I don't think he will.
Well, he said he would, but maybe we're not to take him too seriously. But on that subject, on the subject of not always believing everything the president says, let's talk about taxes. Now, I know you say that he's not for raising taxes, but as you and I know, after the '81 tax cut, which David Stockman described in part as hogs feeding at the trough, not tax simplification, in part, Ronald Reagan has signed into law 4 tax increases since that time. Tax Equity and Fiscal Responsibility Act, Gasoline Tax, Social Security Tax, Deficit Reduction Act. You voted against all four, and I suppose that makes you an interesting representative of Reagan. They sent somebody who couldn't be nailed on it. But the president having
Is there a
told
question
us,
here somewhere?
Yes. The president having protested for so long that he wasn't going to raise taxes, and then 4 times he's reversed himself, how do we know he's not kidding us again?
Because there's no doubt in my mind, at least, maybe in yours, but there's no doubt in my mind and that of the Republican platform that in this economy, we do not need to raise taxes. There is no reason why we need to put another blanket of disincentives on this economy.
I know that, Jack, but you
There's
said
only
that 4
one way
times.
to balance this budget is with more jobs, and that's what's happening under the Reagan-Bush
But you're not the candidate
White House.
yet. Ronald Reagan is. And 4 times you and he have disagreed. Now, you mentioned the Republican platform, but we know that the Republican platform, as it was drafted at the White House request, left a loophole for taxes. You and some of our colleagues in the House stopped that. But what's the accurate reading of Ronald Reagan? Because 4 times he's told us, I won't raise taxes, and in the words of the poem, whispering he would ne'er consent, consented. Is he going to give in again?
Barney, the president has a pretty good record on fulfilling his campaign pledges. And one of those pledges that he has made and our platform makes is that the way to get the deficit down is to expand the economy, create more jobs, and create more opportunity
Well,
for
also
people.
said he'd
You
cut
can't
some
help
spending.
social programs when the economy is in a contraction. The economy was in a contraction in the 1970s,
Jack,
and
if
we
I
have
were you,
made
I
that
wouldn't-
contraction into an expansion. We need to continue that,
I
and a tax
wouldn't
increase would make it very fragile.
I wouldn't cite the deficit as an example of Ronald Reagan keeping his campaign promises, because he promised to cut it. He wasn't able to do that. I don't know exactly why, but it, of course, went way up. But let me ask you about a couple other things. Let's talk about the environment. Ronald Reagan said, let's look at his environmental record. Hazardous waste is a serious issue. He wants to cut that back in terms of funding. We had James Watt and Ann Gorsuch. Are James Watt and Ann Gorsuch the kind of people we can expect to be in charge of environmental policy
Well,
in a
right now,
second
Bill
Reagan
Ruckelshaus,
administration?
right now the administrator for EPA is Bill Ruckelshaus,
Right.
and he's got a pretty good record. He's doing a good job, and I think it's clear in this administration that they want to expand on the issue of the environment in the future. And
Expand
Ruckelshaus
in
not
terms of
only has a
spending?
good record, Ruckelshaus not only has a good record, but he is also receiving bipartisan support, even from members of your own
Oh,
party.
except on acid rain and a whole lot of other issues, the poor man has had his legs cut off every time he's tried to do anything. He is a very decent man, but on acid rain there's nothing. On hazardous waste and Superfund, it's been cut back. What is the Reagan proposals for the environment in the next 4 years?
Well, clearly you have to have a country in which we can live in harmony with the environment. But that also means a strong economy as well as a
You don't want to
commitment
talk
to
about the
clean air
environment,
and
Jack.
clear
We're going to
water.
get back into the economy,
Well,
aren't we?
I'm
You
making
want
the
to talk about the
point.
environment? We'll move on to the next issue. If you don't want to talk about the environment, we'll move on to the next issue.
I'm making the point that you cannot destroy the economy in the process of saving
we
the
stipulate
environment.
to that.
And clearly,
But you won't talk about the economy.
applying technology to the problems of the environment is the single most important goal in the 1980s. But it's going to take technology, not only for air and water, but for those problems that you
Jack,
alluded
if you
to
want to
earlier.
filibuster,
And
you
I'm-
should have taken on Pat Moynihan. Let's get into the question, because the question was the environment. Let's get into the question of the Equal Rights Amendment, which the Reagan administration has been opposing. Is that also a matter for the economy to take care of, or because
As a matter of fact,
if we
as a
get
matter of
Reagan
fact-
re-elected, there will be no Equal Rights Amendment ratified, I assume.
Barney, as a matter of fact, there can be no equal rights when you have the laws that were opened up for people to get into the economy were closed. Those doors were closed. We want to open those doors to
mean,
full
there can't be
opportunity to
equal rights if we have
participate
a
in this
recession?
economy for every single man and woman,
Jack,
irrespective
are you
of
saying
their
we can't
color,
have equal
their
rights if we have a
culture, or
recession?
their creed, or their gender.
Did you say that we can't have equal rights if there's a recession? If this big budget deficit causes a recession, then equal rights goes on the
Barney,
back burner?
There
I'm
is
just
no
asking.
recession. I know you think there will
There never
be
will
one.
be one again?
The only thing you're offering is fear of the future.
No, I'm
we
asking you a
believe that
question
this
about your
economy
answer.
can continue to expand in the 1980s.
I'm asking you whether you're saying that if the economy should take a downturn, there'll be equal rights goes on the back burner. That
Well,
seems to be what you said.
clearly, if a man or woman cannot get a job, or a man or a woman cannot get access to the capital to invest in, say, a new enterprise, it really determines that they cannot have equal opportunity. But those opportunities that were opened by the law, closed by the economy in the Carter years, are now being reopened by Ronald Reagan. And I think the civil
we're
rights
over our
movement of the
time, and
80s
we're
is
not
to
on
get
equal rights
jobs for
amendment either.
people and access to income, access to wealth, and access to the chance to climb that ladder, which was diminished under the Carter administration.
Gentlemen, thank you.
finished.
Okay, thank you, Congressman Frank. Wait, no. Mr. Rusher, you have time for one more question.
Thank you. Just to bring up a new subject, the Republican platform adopted in Dallas was has been as extremely right-wing. You had a great deal to do with that platform. Are those charges true?
I don't think it's a question of right-left or whether it's conservative or liberal. The question is whether we're going to move forward, whether we're going to go backward, back to the Carter-Mondale years in which declining opportunity for each and every American. I want to make the point that you cannot help the poor when the economy is being made poor. The whole economy was in a state of contraction with inflation rising, and that problem really was diminishing opportunity for not only blacks, but men and women throughout this country and throughout the world, because we were no longer an example to the rest of the world. Clearly, it is our platform that pledges to help bring people out of the safety net by creating more jobs, not only in the country, but in the inner city. We're committed to enterprise zones that would totally eliminate the capital gains tax for any man or woman who wanted to invest in a new business or a new enterprise in the inner city to create jobs for minorities. Our party talks about doubling the exemption for members of the family from $1,000 to $2,000, for which we've been called fiscally irresponsible. I'm pleased to be fiscally irresponsible as help keeping the family together.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Congressman Kemp, thank you for being with us. Congressman Barney Frank, now we'll turn to you for the case for domestic policies of the Democratic ticket.
Well, Ronald Reagan had 2 very bad years, and he's had 2 good years in the economy, but he set a record that I don't think has gotten enough attention. Who else could have given us record deficits, doubling the total national debt, while cutting back on environmental protection, cutting Social Security benefits, cutting aid to education, cutting Medicare? Ronald Reagan's priorities are what at issue. The parties haven't disagreed these last couple of years over how much to spend, but what to spend it on. In the Reagan administration, spending has gone up in the least socially useful areas of our economy, and in areas of protecting the environment, of showing some compassion, of investing in education, there have been serious cutbacks. I'm going to ask Governor Michael Dukakis, who's administered the state of Massachusetts during part of this period, to help me discuss that.
Thank you, Governor Dukakis, for being with us.
Governor, thank you for the use of the state.
Delighted to have you all back.
We've heard a lot about a comparison of these 4 years to the 4 years previously, but I think people want to focus on the next 4 years. Where do we stand in terms of the economy, and what can we expect in the years ahead, which is what we're going to decide in the election on Tuesday?
Well, I happen to be fortunate enough, Barney, to be governor of a state that has the lowest unemployment rate of any industrial state in the country, so one would think that I'd be delighted with these policies, but I'm not. And I'm not because I'm concerned about the future. Regardless of what Congressman Kemp says, the economy is slowing down. And not only that, but we are sitting here facing deficits of nearly $200 billion as far as the eye can see. Now, we have 2 candidates running for the presidency of the United States. One, Mr. Reagan, won't confront the deficit, won't tell us what he's going to do about it, thinks it's going to go away, has no plan for it. The other, Walter Mondale, has had the political courage and the will and the good sense to tell us that it's the most important single economic issue facing this country and that the next president of the United States has got to deal with it. You may or may not agree with the details of the Mondale proposal, but the fact that he's confronted it is important, and on that issue and that issue alone, I think he ought to be elected president of the United States.
Let's talk about the specific content of the Mondale proposals for the future versus the Reagan proposals. We all agree that there's got to be cuts in the deficit. We can look at the Reagan record, we can look at the Mondale program. What about the fairness of it all? Where can we expect cuts to come? Where can we expect expenditures to stay where they are in Reagan versus Mondale?
I don't think there's any question about what's happened over the past 4 years. For one thing, the tax cuts the president gave us in 1981 clearly benefited the wealthy. If you're an individual or family making $200,000 a year in this country, you got $60,000 back in tax breaks. If you're a family making $30,000 or less, you got nothing, and in some cases you're paying more. But that's not all. We have more people who are unemployed today than were unemployed when Ronald Reagan became president of the United States. We have more people in America living in poverty today than at any time in the past 20 years, 5 million more than were living in poverty when Ronald Reagan became president. And what I'm concerned about is not only what's happened, but what's ahead. As he said in Boston the other day, you ain't seen nothing yet. Because if he's not willing to cut that defense budget, there's only one other place he can cut. Child nutrition, student assistance, Medicare, all of those things that are designed to lift people out of a condition of dependency and help them to become productive citizens.
How have the states been affected by what the Reagan administration has done in terms of your ability to...
Not surprisingly, 30 states in the past 20 months have had to raise sales and income taxes. And in many cases, those are the states that are hurting most, Illinois and Michigan and Ohio, the states that are in deep trouble economically. Fortunately, my state hasn't been one of them. But this, too, is the result of policies which have been extremely unfair and I think very unwise.
Governor, you've heard the previous witness not want to talk much about the environment. I suppose if I had to defend Reagan.
Why.
Would you discuss the Mondale-Reagan differences on the environment in about the 50 seconds we have left?
Barney, I don't know any issue where there's such an incredible difference between these two candidates. The president's had the worst record in the environment of any president in my lifetime. James Watt, Ann Gorsuch, and I suspect they'll be back or people like them. Walter Mondale believes in caring about the environment. He understands that the quality of our environment is one of the most important issues facing us in our future. And I feel very strongly about that as the governor of the state that has more acid in the rain falling on us than any state in the country. Maybe second to New York, Congressman Kemp's state. Now, we've tried for 4 years, and this isn't a partisan issue, to get the president to confront the issue of acid rain. And you know we've gotten from this administration a big fat zero. I don't think there's any question that if Walter Mondale becomes president of the United States, we'll have an administration that cares about the environment and does something about it.
Thank you, Governor.
Congressman Frank. Now, Bill Rusher, cross-examination.
Thank you. Governor Barney Frank said that he wanted to talk about the future, and so do I. Let's talk about the future under this Mondale administration that some people think is coming in on Tuesday or shortly thereafter. And let's talk about the way in which they propose, in one specific way, in which they propose to reduce this deficit they're so deeply concerned with, the tax increase.
Sure.
How much is he going to increase taxes?
By a sufficient amount to balance that budget.
Yeah, but there's a figure. We know the figure, don't we? Surely he has given us an estimate as of September 10th.
I don't know what the exact figure is.
You don't know the exact figure? Would you accept $85 billion tax increase?
Depends on what kind of a deficit he
bet
faces when he gets in there. It'll be a big one, but I would assume it'll have to be something like that.
I would think it'd be considerably larger, but he says an $85 billion
Same deficit that President Reagan will have to confront if he's reelected.
Right, but not with a tax increase.
Oh, yeah, he'll give us a tax increase. In fact, they're already talking about a tax increase.
Now, Governor, let's talk about your candidate, your affirmative witness. I want to hear about Mr. Mondale. Where is he going to raise this $85 billion? From whom?
Well, he'll raise it first by enforcing the tax laws a lot more aggressively than they've been enforced under this administration, and I suspect there's $20 or $30 billion at least in uncollected taxes that's out there.
But I'm talking about new taxes now.
And in addition to that, he'll attempt to make that tax increase as fair as he possibly can.
I'm sure he will.
I suspect it'll be by eliminating some of the loopholes that Congressman Kemp suggested, but
he's only going to soak the rich. Unfortunately, in his case, the rich begins at $25,000.
No, he's not going to kid the American people. We're facing a $200 billion deficit, and if we're going to cut it, then all of us, or most of us, are going to have to pay something more. We know that.
Yeah. And
he's also going to cut it. He's also going to cut it by reducing a defense budget, which is much too big.
Actually, he calls for a 4 or 5% increase.
Yeah, a lot less than President
Yeah, but
Reagan
not by reducing, Governor. Don't try to sell us that. He's going to increase the defense budget. Now then, get back to the question I asked.
Sure.
Where else is he going to get this tax money? It's going to come from corporations in part,
Sure
isn't it? Yes.
And they ought to be paying substantially more than they're paying today, because they're paying a very small percentage of this budget.
How these Harvard audiences never change. But when the...
they probably reflect the nation as a whole, to tell you the truth.
When the New York Times commented on his plans for hitting corporations, they said that those increased taxes on corporations would largely be borne by consumers as a pass-through. Was the Times correct in that?
I don't think you can really predict that. Some of them will be borne by the companies. Some of them will be
Some will be borne by the companies. A little by the consumer, maybe?
Some of them.
Some of them will be borne by the consumer.
Incidentally, I just want to emphasize, however, that this administration has raised taxes 4 times. And incidentally, Bill, if the president had his way, he'd have raised them again because he wants to tax health insurance benefits.
I don't know about that. I think this administration is known for reducing the taxes. It is true that the Social Security tax went up in this administration because the increase was passed during the Carter-Mondale administration.
1982, this administration gave us the biggest tax increase in history.
Yes,
And they gave us another one in 1982, and another one in 1983, and another one in
now,
1984.
Wait a minute. That you're beginning
And
to
the
misrepresent
president's going to raise
history.
taxes next year. You know that, and I know that.
You would like to believe that, and you would like to be able to prove it, but you can't, Governor, and you'd better stick to the proposal of your candidate to raise the taxes.
Well,
now, let me ask you.
Didn't the president say that he wasn't ruling out taxes?
May I ask the question?
Sure.
What is Mr. Mondale going to do with his $85 billion once he's taxed it from whoever, the rich and the corporations? What is he going to do with it? What's he going to use it for?
He's going to reduce a federal deficit that has to be reduced
Is he
if
now?
we're going to build
How is he
an
going to
economic
prevent
future.
that money from simply being spent? That is a danger, you would appreciate.
Because he said when he proposed it that
Yeah.
he would put it in a trust fund and it would be used only for reducing the deficit.
He would earmark it.
Yes, indeed.
Yes. Now, just, I presume that Speaker O'Neill has also proclaimed that he is willing to earmark it?
I don't know what the speaker...
You don't know whether Speaker O'Neill... Well, isn't that a rather important question? I mean, what good does it do the presumable President Mondale to ask for earmarking if he hasn't bothered to get the promise of the Speaker of the House of Representatives that they will earmark it instead of spending it? I put it to you that every thin dime that is raised in new taxes by Mr. Mondale will be spent, S-P-E-N-T, spent by the Congress of the United States. All of it.
Well, that isn't going to happen, and you know it. But the fact of the matter is that this president has refused to confront the deficit. That this is the president who told us in 1980, speaking of keeping promises, Jack, that he was going to give us a balanced budget by 1984. This is the president who told us that if you took the federal deficit
This is
and
certainly
piled
not
it...
in answer to any question of mine,
the
Governor. May I ask one more? I have 1 minute according to the time cue, and I'd like to ask one more question.
A little less than a minute. Go ahead.
All right. Let's consider real income. Do you happen to know what happened to real income in the last year of the Carter-Mondale administration?
No, I do not.
Real income fell 5%, and black income, real income fell even more than that.
What's happened to it under Reagan?
A very good question. Do you happen to know whether it's falling or rising today?
The average family in this country...
It rose 1.6% from 1982 to 1983, the first increase in 5 years and the largest in a decade. Well, so we've informed you on something, and I think I'll let you to contemplate it. Thank you very much,
seconds
Governor.
to answer if you want to respond.
Yeah. We haven't heard yet what the Reagan administration is going to do about this deficit bill.
Oh, yes, we have. The president himself has
$200
stated
billion as far as the eye can see.
Although I will
and a
say,
president who
Governor,
won't
that
confront it.
converting you Democrats to be concerned about deficits is almost worth it.
Thank you, Mr. Rusher. Congressman Frank, you have another question.
Yes, a horrible enough example can work well with any of us, Bill. The question I want to put to you, Governor, is, first of all, of course, when we talk briefly about the rise in real income that finally came under the Reagan administration, we should be clear that that came from a further drop in the first couple of years of the Reagan administration. And Ronald Reagan never looked so good economically as when you are measuring 83 and 84 against his disastrous 81 and 82. But I want to talk about what we can expect. What can you expect as a governor trying to deal with the problems of education, of the environment, of caring for the elderly who are in need, if we follow the budget priorities that have been shown in the first 4 years of the Reagan administration, if they're replicated?
Bernie, I think we'll see exactly what we saw during the first 2 or 3 years of the Reagan administration. States will be forced either to cut back, and the consequences will be more the kind of thing we had during the first 2 or 3 years of this administration, or to raise taxes. And in some states, taxes will be raised as they have been raised in almost all of the states since Mr. Reagan became president. So that's the Hobson's choice that governors and state legislatures are going to be facing, and it's one, frankly, that I don't want to face, which is why I'm from Walter Mondale for President of the United States.
Governor Dukakis, thank you for being with us. That brings us to the midway point in this debate. We have heard from Congressman Jack Kemp testifying for the Reagan administration domestic policies, Governor Michael Dukakis testifying for Walter Mondale. Now we turn to issues of foreign policy. Mr. Rusher.
As we listen to the opposition's complaints about American foreign policy under President Reagan, I ask you to remember just 2 points. There is not today an American soldier in combat anywhere in the world, and not a single square yard of territory has passed under communist control since Ronald Reagan was inaugurated on January 21st, 1981. How many presidents could say as much? But these things are not accidental. They are the result of wise policies. To discuss those policies, I am proud to present a woman who has skillfully fought America's battles in one of the most hostile of all environments, the United States Ambassador to the United Nations, the Honorable Jeane Kirkpatrick.
Welcome to the Advocates, Ambassador Kirkpatrick.
Thank you. Madam Ambassador, what do you consider the Reagan administration's principal accomplishments in the fields of foreign policy and defense?
First, I think that the President and the administration have restored the American defense position around the world, in fact. Second, I think they've, along with that, strengthened alliances, of course. Third, we have developed some new forms, flexible forms of cooperation with friends and allies to help contain conflict and reinforce peace in the world. Fourth, I think we have, after a rather long period to the contrary, managed to develop means, peaceable means, for reinforcing freedom and independence in the world. Freedom and independence stopped losing, and finally, I would emphasize, peace has been maintained for the United States in this period.
How has the restored confidence and pride that you mentioned manifested itself?
In a great many ways, of course. Social scientists are always impressed by polls and survey research. All survey research and polling today demonstrates that the American confidence in the future has been restored, belief in the future, belief we're going to have a better future, that our best times are still ahead of us. That's a very sharp turnaround. Second, of course, mark of that, the value of the dollar started up after the president was elected and before he was inaugurated as a kind of harbinger of international understanding that something new was going to happen. Simple indicator like the quality and quantity of enlistments and re-enlistments in the making of voluntary military service a practical alternative demonstrates this as well.
And in respect to defense and the restoration of our defenses, what are the principal achievements of the President and his administration in that regard?
Very near the top would be the deployment of the Euro missiles in conjunction with our NATO allies. That's very important because it eliminates some unilateral vulnerabilities of our European allies, which were putting a very heavy strain on NATO, and it takes the strain off NATO and has reinforced it. That's one thing. Second, there has been, of course, a general reinforcement of research and deployment plans for a wide range of weapon systems, including B-1, of course, and long-range cruise missiles and so forth, which had been canceled under the previous administration. I think also the development of flexible forms of cooperation with allies over the world matters here, strengthens us.
Would you mention very briefly, since our time is short, one or two examples of this form of flexible cooperation?
Cooperation with the Gulf states and some European and Asian allies with regard to containing the Gulf War, the Iran-Iraq War. Second, cooperation with Egypt and Sudan in containing Libya's efforts to destabilize the government of Sudan, or cooperation with the French and the Chadian government to contain Chad, to protect Chad. Cooperation with the Eastern Caribbean states to liberate Grenada, and so forth. There are other examples.
Finally, you used an interesting expression in your original answer when you said that freedom has stopped losing. In about 15 seconds, what do you mean by that?
Well, between the fall of Saigon in 1975 and the inauguration of Ronald Reagan, a dozen or so countries either slid into the Soviet bloc or came heavily under Soviet influence, losing effectively their own national independence and their freedom. That simply stopped happening. It isn't happening anymore. We've developed some successful forms of cooperation to procure containment of Soviet expansionism in the world.
I have no further questions.
Congressman Frank, cross-exam.
Thank you. Ambassador Kirkpatrick, I'm sure Jimmy Carter will appreciate your listing first as Ronald Reagan's success, the execution of his plan to place Euro missiles in Western Europe. That's an unexpected piece of bipartisanship, and I'm sure he thanks you. I did notice that when
Mr.
you
Frank,
talked about...
you know those missiles were deployed during the Reagan
Yes,
administration.
and I did not say to the
were.
contrary. Let's not repeat ourselves and use up the time. But it was a Carter policy which Reagan carried out.
Mr. Carter had many policies
yes.
he didn't carry out.
But we ought to stick to the facts of what you were talking about. The point is that it was the #1 success that you listed. You didn't mention, when you talked about foreign policy, the Middle East very much. You talked about the Gulf states. When you talked about renewed confidence and pride, I asked about Lebanon. We were told that no Americans are now in combat, but a goodly number died in Lebanon in behalf, it seemed to me, of a policy that made very little sense and that was based on misunderstandings by Secretary Shultz about Syria. How do you characterize the American involvement in Lebanon under this administration? Is this an example of its successful foreign policy?
Mr. Frank, I characterize that as a tragedy. The Marines were murdered in their sleep by terrorists. The Marines were there as part of an international, multinational peacekeeping force in Lebanon, sent with the consent of the Congress and after careful consultation and in cooperation with the British, the French, the Italians, and the
Ambassador
Israelis.
Kirkpatrick? Yes, we're not running against the terrorists here. Of course we condemn the terrorists. The question is this administration's pretensions to having toughened America and made people respect America. We've been blown up regularly in Lebanon, and the Lebanese policy was, what about Secretary Shultz's assumption that if Israel signed a treaty that they pressured Israel into signing, Syria would then withdraw its troops if Israel did? Was that an accurate assumption? Is that an example of perspicacity at the State Department?
Mr. Frank?
Yes, is that an example of perspicacity at the State Department, George Shultz's views of Syria and the Lebanon situation?
Look, Mr. Frank, I don't even know what you're talking about anymore. I know that the Marines...
Let me explain
I know the
George
Marines
Schultz
went
said,
to Lebanon. Was that a question? Is this a cross-examination?
Would you like the question? Yes. George Shultz said that if Israel signed the treaty that he pressured them into signing, Syria would agree to withdraw its troops. They didn't, and the tragedy of Lebanon then unfolded. Is that an example of successful foreign policy?
You know, there have been a great many words given and a great many commitments broken in the course of Lebanon's recent history. And some of those commitments broken resulted in the murder of our Marines and also in the murder of a good many French troops and in the murder of some Israelis at exactly the same time. And some of those commitments broken resulted in the Syrians refusing to do what they had committed to do. Now, is that based on a misunderstanding? I'm not sure it's a misunderstanding. It is certainly a commitment violated, and from that experience we should learn. By Syria, clearly.
Okay.
By clearly.
Well, again, it seems to me totally at odds with your description of this tough and successful and respected America. Let's talk about reinforcing freedom.
I don't think our side is necessarily the one inclined to
say that
believe
we would
that any old agreement with any old party is likely to be regarded as sacred.
Ambassador
by all
Kirkpatrick,
of
that
them.
tactic is simply out of line. No one here is defending the terrorists, the Syrians. We're talking about the claims that this administration that's been able to cope with it. We know there are bad people in the world. It doesn't solve anything to point to them. The question is how successfully do you cope with them. Now let's turn to reinforcing freedom.
Is how do we cope with them?
The question is reinforcing freedom. You said that's one of the things we're doing. The Nobel Prize was just given to Bishop Tutu in South Africa, who said that the Reagan administration has made the white-dominated government more intransigent. We've had this policy of constructive engagement. There's still the South Africans in charge of Namibia. We have a Nobel Prize winner denouncing America for its complicity with the South African regime. Is that an example of reinforcing freedom under this administration?
No, Mr. Frank. Mr. Frank, I would like to say that I have personally very high regard for Bishop Tutu. I think he's wrong about the policy of constructive engagement and wrong about its effects on South Africa even. And I do not think, though, that we want to suggest here that that we're going to take as a measure of U.S. policy the views of anyone and everyone who have won a Nobel Prize on whatever subject.
No,
I don't think you'd like to do that
Tutu.
either, Congressman Frank. I
Tutu.
really don't think you'd like to. I'm sure Mr. Solzhenitsyn, for example, has views about the world and foreign policy that you wouldn't like to accept
I asked about
today.
Mr. Tutu. I did not suggest that we do every Nobel Prize
Yes, but you're
winner.
recommending him as a Nobel Prize winner.
Yes, and as a leading South African. He is both. Let's ask about Ronald Reagan and arms reduction. He's opposed every arms reduction effort by every president. Ronald Reagan said when he ran for president, under this president and this Secretary of State, the nation has become #2 in a world where it is dangerous to be second best. collapse of American will and the retreat of American power. That's what he said about Ford and Kissinger. Is this the reflection of a man who has any interest at all in reaching serious agreements when he's criticized the Nixon and the Ford efforts to negotiate with the Russians as well as everybody else?
Question.
Congressman Frank, I think that the world today is clearly safer for our values, and our civilization. It's safer because we're stronger, because the president does have a commitment to peace. He has maintained
Not one
peace.
word about arms reduction, Ambassador
He has
Kirkpatrick?
maintained peace, and he has created a new correlation of forces, the Soviets like to call it, which puts us today in a position to negotiate arms control agreements
for the
with
next
the Soviets
administration.
in the next administration, where we'll find them. Not in the last administration, where Mr. Carter abandoned his
Ford
own
or Nixon
treaty.
or
Thank
Johnson
you,
or Kennedy or
Congressman.
Eisenhower.
Thank you. Mr. Rusher, one more question for Ambassador Kirkpatrick.
Madam Ambassador, I'd just like to share with you a quotation from one of our prominent public officials, September 21st, 1982. I quote him verbatim. "I think the president did the right thing. I think there's a need to get forces in Lebanon to stabilize the situation." Close quote. Do you take the same comfort that I do in reflecting that the man who said that was Walter Mondale?
It doesn't surprise me, Mr. Rusher. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Kirkpatrick. We now move to Congressman Frank to make his case for Mr. Mondale's foreign policy.
It's no surprise that the pro-Reagan witness didn't want to mention the words arms reduction because of the president's glaring failure in that area. Nor did we hear anything of success claimed for the policy in Nicaragua, which has been a national embarrassment with murder manuals and mined harbors. And we have a Middle Eastern policy that not only cost the lives of those 250 Marines for no purpose, but which recently been criticized by the longtime American ambassador to Israel as being inept in terms of the peace process. To discuss that, I'm going to ask Senator Christopher Dodd, a foreign policy expert, to join us. Senator, we've heard now about how great things are going in foreign policy, except when a couple of bad people sometimes mess us up. What about Central America, about which you're quite an authority? Is this an example of the renewed success of American foreign policy?
Well, I think it's worthwhile to ask the question the President likes to bring up and ask whether or not we're better off in the world today after 4 years of Reagan foreign policy. And whether you look in Central America, the Middle East, or in arms control, I think the answer is a resounding no. We find in Central America, in 1980, we had 150 advisors in the Central American region. Today, there are almost 2,000. It's becoming an armed camp.
But they're not in combat.
Well,
Vacation,
we find them walking around and conducting a variety of different maneuvers, which places them, of course, in a very serious situation. I think this administration has played right into the hands of Fidel Castro, if you will, by trying to militarize this situation rather than support our allies in the region who have sought diplomatic and political solutions. 4 democratic countries in this hemisphere, Venezuela, Colombia, Panama, and Mexico, have strongly advocated for 4 years that we try and find a political diplomatic solution to the problems of El Salvador and Nicaragua. This administration has hardly given even tacit support to that proposal, the Contadora process. In fact, in a 130-page report, the Kissinger Commission report, the Contadora process, a unique historical achievement in this hemisphere, was relegated to a 1-paragraph mention as a way of trying to resolve these difficulties.
Senator, we're all concerned about spending money. What's this cost us, this success and lack of it in Central America?
Well, we've spent $1 billion in El Salvador in the last 4 years, and we find ourselves 4 years later with 40,000 civilian deaths in that country. Still virtually a stalemate with no prospect of it seem to be improving except the courageous act of President Duarte, which this administration opposed, by the way. President Duarte's effort to sit down and at least without any preconditions to try and negotiate or discuss some political resolution of these problems with the insurgents.
Let's underline that. That's a proposal, negotiating with the rebels, that the Reagan administration has quite explicitly been against. Is that correct?
They have opposed it all the way along the line. They went along with it the other day because President Duarte decided he was going to do it regardless of the
Aren't they entitled to credit for the flexibility with which they claim success for the policy they'd opposed?
Better said.
Let's get on to nuclear arms reduction, so that at least one of our witnesses today will talk about it some. You've been around Washington some time. What's been the record of this administration? We can't be sure the Russians are serious about it, but do you think we'll ever find out if we continue to follow the policies that Ronald Reagan has followed with regard to nuclear arms reduction?
Well, I think it's interesting to look at the Reagan record as an individual when it comes to arms control. There have been 21 separate arms control agreements negotiated by 6 American presidents over 3 decades. Ronald Reagan, as an individual, as both a public and a private citizen, has outspokenly opposed every single arms control agreement, including such things as the ABM Treaty, the ban on testing in the atmosphere and beneath our ocean floors, agreements that were supported by broad-based coalitions and groups in this country. I think to anticipate a second Reagan administration in the area of arms control, that they will do anything, is a pipe dream. My guess is that we will see a continued escalation in the proliferation of nuclear weapons, and the Reagan administration will do virtually nothing in this arena.
What about the question of the Middle East, which we've heard alluded to because of our work with the Gulf states? How would you characterize our Middle Eastern policy under this administration?
Again, a disaster. Here we had one of the most important and significant agreements ever reached, the Camp David Accords. And they have become nothing more than an asterisk under this administration. We found an administration within days of taking office moved to a thing called strategic consensus, which was a failure in the Eisenhower administration. The Dulles policy that they tried in those days that crumbled as well. We find ourselves today in a situation where Israel is under more threat than they were when they had the Camp David Accords moving forward. And to suggest somehow that a president of the United States does not have to assume the responsibility of placing American lives in jeopardy when there were strong voices within the administration, by the way, who cautioned against the reckless action of placing Marines and the kind of situation they were in. It was virtually the Rubik Cube. We fell right into it, and ultimately we had to leave. And of course the price was that 240-odd young Americans lost their lives as a result of that policy. And the president has to assume responsibility as chief executive officer of this country for their deaths.
Thank you, Congressman
Thank you,
Frank. Mr. Rusher, cross-examination.
Senator Dodd, when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, the Christian Science Monitor quoted Walter Mondale as saying, "I cannot understand, it just baffles me why the Soviets these last few years have behaved as they have." Is there any reason to think Mr. Mondale today is any less baffled than he was then?
Well, I think, first of all, we find, of course, the Soviets are still in Afghanistan, and despite the rhetoric of this administration, that situation hasn't improved at all. A lot of bombast, but not much else from this administration.
And is Mr. Mondale still baffled?
No, I think Mr. Mondale was saying by being baffled, and he said he found it so deplorable that he couldn't understand. It's hard to understand, I suppose.
He said he couldn't understand.
Well, it's hard to understand as a person who has the values that Fritz Mondale does.
Right.
Why a nation like the Soviet Union would invade in Afghanistan.
Puzzles him.
I think that's very indicative of his
approach.
Indeed. Very indicative of his approach, that he is not going to engage in that kind of conduct of foreign policy.
Right.
And that's the distinction, I think.
Thank you. Recently, President Duarte of El Salvador had a first meeting with the Salvadoran rebels, as we know. I suggest to you that it was President Reagan's faith in El Salvador and in Mr. Duarte and the aid he gave Duarte that enabled Duarte to get to the point of looking for peace. I'd invite you to comment on that as briefly as possible because we have other questions.
Well, certainly we all applaud the action of President Duarte in sitting down with the
No, I mean the action of
insurgents.
President Reagan, as I outlined.
The administration opposed the idea of President Duarte having any kind of contact with the insurgents of that country. They have a 3.5-year record of that. President Duarte finally decided he would do it on his own, that he would go forward anyway. The administration then said they agreed with it occurring, but they opposed any contact. They were for an all-out military win in El Salvador, even with the evidence indicated that a stalemate was best.
I thought you might say that. And now I must tell you that you are contradicting President Duarte himself. He said on ABC's Nightline, and I quote him verbatim, "I thank Mr. Reagan, who had faith in my country and faith in me to give us this opportunity and for helping me to obtain all the aid that was necessary to get to this point, to the point of looking for peace." Do you think President Duarte was wrong, too?
No, I think the
No,
point,
you
the
think he was
question
right?
was, the question was whether or not this administration supported
Yes. And I had just
negotiation or
quoted
a
Duarte to
dialogue
that
as a way of trying to resolve the difficulties of that country. This administration has a 3.5-year record of opposing that kind of a solution to the problem of El Salvador.
Not according to
That is
President
what is
Duarte.
central.
Not according to President Duarte, Senator.
Well,
I have quoted him verbatim.
Well, I'm very much familiar with the administration's policies, having sat in on a variety of meetings where I've heard them talk about that.
Well,
that
Ambassador Kirkpatrick passed a note to me, and she said you were wrong, and I expect she's more familiar with him than you are.
Well, I'd
But,
be surprised if she said otherwise. But
by
that's
the
not
way,
case.
do you agree with Mr. Mondale that the invasion of Grenada was justifiable, or with Mrs. Ferraro that it wasn't?
No, I think the issue of Grenada, was not so much...
on the question a little
Yes,
bit?
and I will. And the point in Grenada,
Justifiability of the invasion.
the point of the invasion of Grenada, certainly where American lives are in jeopardy, where security interests of this country, then the use of military force is clearly a legitimate extension of our foreign policy. The problem with this administration and the Grenadian situation was that was the only option. Here you had Maurice Bishop coming to Washington, trying to sit down with people. If Ambassador Kirkpatrick had maybe opened up her door to him and listened, then possibly we could have avoided the use of military force of trying to achieve the same
That was
result.
going to be my
That's
next
been the
question.
basic problem.
That was going to be my next question. I thought that Mr. Mondale did say, I do not believe Mr. Reagan adequately explored diplomatic solutions to the problems in Grenada. I take it that you think taking it up with the United Nations would have been some nice way to handle Grenada. Is that right?
Not necessarily. Don't listen.
necessarily.
The point is this: we are a large superpower, a big nation. If you exercise military force as your first and only option, you jeopardize the security interests of this country.
Yeah.
We ought to have other alternatives in our quiver, other than just the military response.
And
if
while
those
you are-
other alternatives, let me respond.
Go
If those
ahead.
other alternatives
We have a
fail
minute.
to work, then certainly you can use and should use military force if you have to.
And in the
but that
Grenada-
ought not to be the first arrow you draw from that quiver.
precisely.
And this administration has only done that.
Mrs. Woodruff, if Senator Dodd's friends insist upon applauding at length after every answer, I'm going to need a little extra time. I hope it's not coming out of
You
my...
have
They're not
about,
friends, they're just bright, intelligent
They're
people.
admirers,
in
yes.
any event, you have about 30 seconds.
Well, let me have that and a little bit more. Of course, when you have hostages or potential hostages taking all these other courses first and postponing the military action till later may wind up with another hostage situation. But you Democrats know all about hostage
No,
situations.
what's the question? I mean,
Let me ask you another question instead.
Let him...
Mr. Mondale has
audience.
called for a mutual and verifiable freeze. The reporters chased him all over Kansas City in the second debate, trying to get him to tell them what was verifiable. How do you verify production?
Well, first of all, I think we have, now we find people claiming that there have been all sorts of Soviet violations of existing agreements.
How
I
do
presume
you
we have some
verify
system of
production?
verification that the administration is
Brief
satisfied
answer,
with.
Senator.
Production.
I believe today there exists in more than adequate amounts the ability to verify.
How?
If you look at this issue, not in counting each individual weapon,
Yeah.
but in looking in the overall balance between Soviet and U.S.
there
power,
is, in fact,
then there
no
is
way
a
to
way
verify
We'll have to stop it
production.
there.
And there
Thank
is
you, Mr.
verification.
Rusher.
Thank you very much.
One more question from Congressman Frank.
Well, Senator, as you were suggesting, it's ironic that those who claim we can't verify the future one know exactly how many violations there were in the last one. Maybe
That's
a little
correct.
bird told them. But the question I would like to ask is, we've been asked about understanding the Russians. Ambassador Kirkpatrick was quite honest and didn't even pretend that they tried to get an arms reduction agreement in the first administration. The others don't quite be that explicit. Question is this. When Ronald Reagan admitted that he proposed an agreement to the Russians when he didn't know that land-based missiles were the basis of their defense system, do you think that was conducive to getting an arms reduction agreement?
No, this is a major problem. Here's the chief executive officer of this country, and he fails to have even a rudimentary, fundamental knowledge of what the issues are in the arms control debate and discussion. That, frankly, is something that ought to disturb every single American, regardless of their ideological, philosophical, or political leanings.
We'll have to wrap it up there. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Senator Dodd, for being with us on the advocates. Each advocate now has 1 minute to make a closing statement, and we will begin with Congressman Frank.
We'll decide on Tuesday what kind of society we want to be. Do we want equal rights and ratify an equal rights amendment? Do we want to go back to a period when we had an administration trying to subsidize racist schools? Do we care about our environment? Do we spend unlimited amounts on the Pentagon and have multi-thousand-dollar coffee pots and unneeded MX missiles while we cut Medicare? Do we have a tax system which shows some concern for fairness? Those are the questions. We're in an era when we've got to cut federal spending. Both sides agree to that. The question is, where does it come from? Does it come from subsidy of the Contras in Nicaragua and from unnecessary Pentagon spending and from wasteful agricultural subsidies?
Sorry. Congressman Frank. Mr. Rusher, a brief closer.
60 seconds to sum up 4 years. A nation strong and at peace, an economy revived and booming, a sense of national pride and optimism restored. Which of these shall I stress in this last minute? I think it should be the third. We have known bad times in this country, and we have endured wars, but as long as America retained her pride and her innate optimism, she has always pulled through. In the 1970s, we came perilously close to losing these with incalculable consequences. President Carter went on national television to tell us that we were suffering from a vast national malaise. Banishing that mood has, I think, been Ronald Reagan's biggest single achievement. In foreign affairs, he has given us reason to be proud again. At home, he has restored the optimism on which prosperity depends. I have no doubt at all what the decision of the American people will be next Tuesday, but I do hope they will send to Washington a Congress that will work with him. Thank you very much.
It's been enlightening, and we hope that tonight's debate will help you in making your choice for president. Thanks to our advocates, William Rusher and Barney Frank, to their distinguished witnesses. Thanks to the Institute of Politics here at Harvard University. I'm Judy Woodruff. Thank you for being with us.
The Advocates was made possible in part by a grant from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.